Okay, here we are on office hours for week 6, sorry. I'm supposed to have Skip Pomeroy today, who is a chemist, who is going to help us talk about conversion of lipids into biofuels. But like all chemists, Skip is time challenged, so he's not here yet. But maybe he'll show up in a little while, and when he does, we'll incorporate him in. In the meantime, we'll just go over a couple of questions that have rolled in this week. I see not too many. Apparently you guys are all getting ready for Halloween here in the States. Today is Halloween, big holiday for us. But anyway, let me go over a couple of these, and then we'll see if Skip shows up to help answer some of the ones on fuels. All right, here's one from Mitchell. Mitchell always sends in good questions. Let's see what he says today. Anyway, he says, algae ponds, do the white colored liners appreciably impact productivity, or do the liners just help keep it clean? So the liners just help keep it clean. The white is not reflective. I mean, it is reflective. I should not say that. The liners, the white liners are definitely reflective, but that is not the reason you put them in. You put them in because that keeps water from soaking out the bottom, and it keeps stuff from growing in. The problem is the liners are the most expensive part of the pond. Next to the paddle wheels and putting CO2 in, that's absolutely the most expensive part of it. So most people who think that we're going to go to big scale in biofuels, the only way we get there is by doing unlined ponds. They're not truly unlined. You line them with clay, or you line them with salt. You line them with something that still blocks water from leaking out, but you do so, mainly just to reduce that water loss. Okay. They do have one really big added benefit, and that is, especially if you're doing some high value product in them, like the guys who grow food in them, you can actually get liners that are food grade, and then it helps a lot in the harvesting. Okay. All right. Let's see. I think I see actually Skip wandering around out there. So hold on for 1 second, and then I will get him. No. Okay, back to our questions. Let's see. Let's get ones that are okay. I don't know. Here's one with some calculations from Peter Gravel. We'll see if we can answer these. Photosynthesis is 3% efficient. Gas diesel engines are 30 to 50% efficient. So fuel from agriculture are 1.5% efficient overall. Solar panels are 12 to 22% efficient, and with batteries, 80% for total. So they can be between 10 and 20% efficient. We should subsidize electric cars. Agreed? So Peter, you will know that I own an electric car, and so I don't know about should we subsidize them or not, but electric cars are a wonderful thing. But this is a calculation that engineers love to make. What they love to tell you is that, solar panels can be, 30% efficient, and photosynthesis theoretical max is 11%. So solar panels win every time. The problem with that simple calculation is that what you're calculating in that case is the amount of photons that are landing in a square meter or in an area, and how much of those photons can be converted to electricity. So, two things. First and foremost, there's an enormous difference between an electron and a liquid hydrocarbon fuel. We pay an enormous premium for liquid fuels. We do that for two reasons. One is because electrons cannot be stored in anything other than a battery. Okay, so once you make electricity, you're on the grid, you have to use that immediately. the really wonderful thing about fuels is that once you have a liquid fuel, a petroleum-based hydrocarbon, you can store that for months or years, or in the case of crude oil, we have stored that underground for 300 million years. It didn't go anywhere, okay? That's why you pay an enormous premium for it, number one, because it's stored for instantaneous use. Doesn't matter if it's 3 a.m., if it's 3 a.m., good luck powering anything with a solar panel, all right? Those things are off and they're not producing anything. That's number one. Number two, the energy density of a battery is 1% of the energy density of a liquid fuel. What does that mean? That means if I fill up a tank, if I fill up a car with 300 pounds of fuel and I drive that thing, in order to get the same range, I would have to have 3,000-pound battery, okay? And I'm sorry, a 30,000-pound battery. And so that just doesn't cut it. So batteries and electrons and electric cars are fantastic for short distance trips. I have an electric car. I charge that thing up. I get 80 miles of charge on it in my batteries. They take up 1/3 of the volume of the car, but you know what? They drive that car to and from. It gets from my house down to here. Works absolutely fantastic. So in many ways, you are completely comparing apples and oranges to try to think an electric car to a liquid fuel. So you will never have an electric powered truck and you'll never have an electric powered airplane. Okay, so that's number one. Number two, the comparison with this 12 to 22% efficiency, that is of the system once it's built and deployed. Okay, you have to do something called a life cycle assessment. In a life cycle assessment, what you do is you calculate all the energy that went into that thing to build it. It takes a huge amount of energy to build a photovoltaic panel. You have to have factories and people employed to build these things. The really wonderful thing about agriculture, and the reason it works even at a low percent efficiency, is because they are self-assembling organisms. So when I go out to a cornfield, if I'm going to make corn ethanol, I don't have factory workers there. I put seeds in the ground and those things self-assemble into a corn plant. So the real numbers that you have to consider are, what is my total overall efficiency? So photovoltaic panels last about 20 years. They actually have to be washed every year or two if you want to keep them up at anything like that efficiency. Their efficiency drops off here in California because of dust about 40% a year if you don't clean them. So you have to count the energy of going out and cleaning those things. You have to count the energy of building them. You have to count everything. And when you do all that, what you really come up with is that the actual solar conversion efficiency isn't really a big part of the equation. So much solar energy lands on the ground 6,000 times more than the total energy we consume, that the solar energy is not rate limiting, okay? So it's not that we have to have super high efficiency because we don't have enough land. We have plenty of land for the amount of energy that we burn in this country, right? The problem is, how do you get a system that the economics work out? And so that's really the calculation you're making, all right? So liquid fuels, 3 times more valuable than electric fuels. Efficiencies are better in solar panels, but when you do the full life cycle assessment, they're maybe twice as much, and they don't self-assemble, right? You have to pay somebody to do that. So all of those things added in tell me that photovoltaic and electric cars are going to be fantastic addition to our arsenal to reduce our carbon footprint. The photovoltaics that I'm putting on my house starting in 2 weeks will make enough energy to power my entire house plus power my car. Enormous benefit, but no way, shape, or form am I stopping to work on biofuels, because we need biofuels for airplanes, we need biofuels for boats, we need biofuels for trains, we need biofuels for heavy equipment. Every airplane sold today has an expectancy that is going to last 40 years. So every jet that's flying today, those people are buying those jets with the assumption that they will get to put liquid fuels into those, not electric batteries, for the next 40 years. Same if you bought a boat, they go longer than 40 years, and trains are about the same. Train, you also have an expectation of a diesel train to last 40 years. So it's not an either or, sort of equation. It's how do we manage to cut back our energy use how do we manage to cut back our fossil fuel use, keep our energy use, more efficient, probably smaller in the United States going forward. That's the real question, and we're going to do that with all things. We're going to do that with biofuels, certainly diesel from algae. We're going to do it with cellulosic ethanol. We're going to do it with photovoltaics. We're going to do it with all of those things. So I think this idea that one system is going to win is not. It's not the right thing to be asking. The thing to be asking is how do we in a most efficient way possible keep our quality of life high, which means an ability to feed ourselves, to house ourselves, to move ourselves around. I like traveling all over the world. I hope we don't get rid of airplanes in the next few years. And I hope they don't become so expensive because fuel becomes so expensive that I can't fly over to Europe anymore or to Asia, because those are places that I've been before and want to go again to. And so for those, we're going to keep biofuels going. Okay, let's get another one. What's this one say? This one says from Tori M. Whether upgrading biogas can significantly displace natural gas in sufficient quantities to effectively reduce fossil carbon emissions on a significant scale is unclear. Are there enough sources of biogas raw materials to feed demand? So there's sort of two ways to answer that. So one is, and I know many people, including good engineering friends of mine, have looked at the overall amount of fossil fuel that we burn and made a sort of simplistic calculation that if we took all the biomass on the planet, that still is not the same amount of energy therms that we use in fossil fuel, and therefore we're all doomed and we shouldn't do anything. Okay? So look, you can sort of make these doomsday calculations, but I think those kind of calculations have, number one, have little to do with reality, but really don't address the fundamental question. So there's really two parts to this. One is, how can we be much more efficient at the energy we use now? And we get more efficient every year. One of the wonderful examples that you'll see in one of the last videos on this course is from Alexand and what he's doing down in Nepal. And in Nepal, they get LED lights into houses, and a 1 watt, so 1 watt, okay, not 100 watts like our standard light bulb, a 1 watt light can now put out 90 lumens. And 90 lumens is the amount of energy from 90 candles. Okay, that's what a lumen is. A lumen is the measure of, 1 lumen is what a candle puts out. Okay, burning. And that means a 1 watt bulb can actually put out enough light that a person sitting at a desk can read. You can read under that 1 watt bulb. You can cook under that 1 watt bulb. You could type on your computer under that. So we are getting much, much more efficient at energy use. Okay. Number two, right now, we simply throw a lot of things away. Meaning that, look, in San Diego now, we're getting much better at recycling. But it used to be people threw their newspapers and their food waste, you just tossed them in the trash, and those went into a landfill, right? An enormous waste of energy, okay? And in that landfill, those things degraded, turned into biogas, and that biogas escaped and was a greenhouse gas, because methane is a really bad greenhouse gas. And what you get out of biogas degradation, degradation of organic things in a dump is you get CO2 and you get methane. You also get sulfur, so they stink. So those things stunk, literally stunk, and put out huge amounts of gas. Well, we don't do that anymore, okay? Now we take those things and we recycle them. So is that going to give us enough gas to replace all of our natural gas that we use right now? No, right? Probably not. But many estimates come up and say that, hey, we've done an assessment of this and we can get 20 or 25% of it. No problem at all. One of the lectures, I think, from Mitch Hine talks about using wind power and bacteria. Believe it or not, you can feed electrons to bacteria. Get those electrons from wind power at night, feed them to the bacteria, and they will convert those electrons into methane. They will use that energy and make methane from CO2. So now we have a new way to get a renewable methane and then put that into the pipeline. So I think there are lots of opportunities as we get more clever to be much more efficient about the resources that we do use, to get much better about recycling everything we use, right? And so, you know, your simple question was, are there enough sources of biogas raw material to feed demand? There are certainly enough of those that we can make a significant dent in the you know, the fossil methane that we use right now. To 100% of it, no, not today, but maybe in the future, maybe we'll be able to do that. Okay. Here's another one from Edward G. This is actually a better question for Skip, but I'll take a stab at it. And he says, are diesel engines really more durable than spark ignition engines, or is durability really controlled by engineers that design them? I'm sure Skip can give you a much better engineering explanation than this. But whenever I go out fishing, and I do here in San Diego several times a year, diesel engines are what are in boats. And they're also in trains, and they're also in trucks. And they are in those because those engines last forever. That is just the nature of the beast. Yeah, so in that sense, I don't think this is a debatable thing. Diesel engines are much more durable than spark plug engines because of the design. Now, a separate question from that is, can you engineer better engines? Clearly, yes. You know, the gasoline engines that we have today are way, way better than the gasoline engines I had when I was a kid. When I was a kid growing up, I had a 64 Ford Falcon that my father owned that got dumped down to me. And the nice thing about that engine was when you opened it up, it was really simple. You recognized everything in it. And my brother and I took that engine apart and put it back together. And we put new rings on it and new head gasket, and we could fix that thing. That thing was the most inefficient, you know, low compression engine imaginable. And now we have these just really nice computer controlled, you know, the gas mix is controlled much better. So engineering design principles absolutely make all engines more durable. They absolutely all get better. But I believe the underlying principles of a diesel engine simply make them more durable than gasoline engines. And like I said, my simple argument for that is boats use them, and boats use them because when you're out on the ocean, you don't get to pull over and fix your engine, right? If that thing fails, you can be in a lot of trouble. So they use the most durable engines out there, and those are diesel. And you know, I happen to also know from talking to the boat captains out there that some of these boats have engines that have run 40,000 hours, you know, before you replace them. So they run a very long time before they go out. Okay, here's one from Sophie G. She says, which industries can benefit from thermochemical conversion plants waste? I'm not sure exactly what that means. Does return minerals to, does return minerals to the soil mean fertilizer for agriculture? Okay, good. So I think what she's asking here is whenever you have thermochemical conversion, so you take cellulosic ethanol and rather than degrade it with enzymes, you break this down by thermochemical properties, you are still only extracting out of that the organic fraction, which means you're getting the carbon and the things linked to carbon, okay? You're not getting all of the other minerals that are in that plant, all right? Because when you harvest these things, they have magnesium in them, they have iron in them, they have all kinds of things, and the soil needs those minerals back. All right, so that is called ash, quite common when everything is said and done in the thermochemical process. There's a process that's called tar. That's sort of the undefined organic super complex things that didn't break down. And then when you burn those, which you can burn those, you end up with ash, and that ash is the mineral content. And that does go back to the farms and is put back on the soil because you want to replace that iron and magnesium and all the other metals that you might pull out of that. You also get a fair amount of silicon in there, sand, all right, and you put that back out on the land. But that's crops don't use that. That just gets taken up by them and part of the minerals in them, but it's actually not required for their growth. Okay. And then she also says, can the outputted water pure enough for agriculture use? Or the tars used for charcoal? Yeah, so you can use the tars from that, put those back on as a soil amendment. They're quite often acidic. They're sometimes a little nasty, and you have to clean them up before you can do things with them. So in general, they're not used for that. They're used to burn because they do have an energy component still in them, and you can burn them. And when you burn them, you can get the energy out for the thermochemical conversion. And although the water coming out of that, yes, any water that comes out of the system can be very pure. It is not used for agriculture. It's just, at least the ones that are running right now, it's a waste stream. But I'm sure in the future, if water becomes super valuable, and some people think that it might, then maybe we will use them for that. Okay. Here's one from Tony H. How practical and economical would it be to make ethanol production much more carbon neutral by using only biomass or even ethanol to heat fermentation and have harvest machinery run on ethanol? Okay, so that's a complex question, but let me answer it this way. In this country, when we make ethanol, whether it's cellulosic ethanol or whether it's corn ethanol, the energy intensive part of that is the distillation of the ethanol out of the water. And we are not allowed to burn the biomass, the bagasse from sugarcane or the corn stalks in order to generate that heat. But in Brazil, you can do that. So we don't do it here because of air quality rules, because it puts particles out in the air for a lot of reasons, okay? So we don't do it here. Instead, we use something else to generate that. Generally, methane is the best one. It's the most efficient one. It's the lowest carbon one to use that one. But you got to have energy in, because you got to heat that water up to distill that stuff off. But in Brazil, where they're allowed to use the gas either directly to heat it because they burn it in a boiler, or to make electricity, which then they use the electricity to distill it. In those cases, that's a lower carbon footprint, and the economics work out much better. Okay, so it's in theory a much better way to get the ethanol out of the water from fermentation, and we are certainly allowed in this country to burn biomass in renewable power. In fact, I think up to 20% of biomass put into a traditional steam power plant, electrical generating power plant, if you add that to coal or if you add that to one of the other fossil fuels that you're burning, can actually make them more efficient. And the reason for that is because there's a fair amount of oxygen in biomass, so it burns hotter and burns faster, okay? So you can actually increase the burn rate for those other fossil fuels by adding the biomass to it. So that can be much better, and we do that now. There are places in the United States where we're starting to add it to it. So that can make it much more efficient, and there's several research groups that are working on this, because many people have said, or maybe arrived at the conclusion, hey, it might be better, rather than taking cellulose and attempting to go through all the rather intensive processes to either break that down biochemically into sugars and then ferment them, or to break them down by thermochemical into some sort of liquid fuels and reformat them into liquid fuels. Hey, maybe it's better just to take that biomass, burn it, and get low carbon electrical power. And so we think about those things now. And by we, I don't mean me personally. I think about biofuels, but other people who work on these things think about that. It's called renewable power. Clearly, it's got sort of some good ideas behind it, and people are making progress on that. Okay, so I guess that was a long-winded way to say in Brazil it's absolutely practical and that's how they do it. In this country it could be practical, but it's not the way we do it, but we're working our way toward it. Okay. Okay, here's one that comes from Valerio T, and he says, do you think that the goal of 1 million electric hybrid vehicles on the road in the US will be fulfilled by 2015? Do you have any information on that? So I was just talking to somebody about this today because I bought an electric car about a month ago. And interestingly enough, when I was down at my favorite little coffee cart last Saturday morning, you know, with all the other local surfers who get up early and go get a cup of coffee before they go check the surf, I happen to be telling them, oh yeah, that's my new electric car right over there. And one of the other guys said, there's my new electric car. And the third guy said, oh, my new electric car isn't here, but I've got one. So 3 of the 6 of us who happened to be there had all purchased electric cars in the last month. So in California, this has completely taken off. Now, California is the #1 state in the country for electric cars. It's also the #1 state in the country for cars. Okay, we have a little over 36 million people who live here and a little over 18 million cars. So we have 1 car for every 2 people. So, you know, the goal of getting to 1 million electric cars by 2015, that's only next year. We're not quite on path to get to that number, but I think we are on path to sell 1 million electric cars a year after that. I'll look those numbers up for you after I leave, and we'll find a way to post them. But I think this is really accelerated amazingly fast. And in fact, the analogy that one of the guys at lunch was making when we were talking about this was, it seems to him that electric cars are just like digital photography. When this showed up about 10 years ago, you know, the first year when they came out, you know, and people had these fully digital cameras with no film in them at all, they were very expensive and film was much, much cheaper. And everybody who had a, you know, the standard 35mm film camera sort of looked at these things and said, oh, but they're so cumbersome, you know, well, you'd have to have an enormous storage on your computer to store all the pictures, and they're not solid, you can't look at them. And, you know, there were sort of lots of inconvenient things that you had to go along with. So not only did you have to get, you know, your digital camera, but you had to get everything digital. But lo and behold, in the next couple of years, everything went digital anyway. You know, music went digital, you know, mail went digital, everything went digital. Now, I don't think it would even be possible to go buy a camera. I'm sure you can. I'm sure you can buy a camera that still uses film, because I know there are some artsy people who tell me that black and white, you know, film has subtleties and grain densities that are impossible to get with digital, but nobody else in the world uses them. Everybody is all digital photography now. So it went from nothing to completely saturating the market in a very short period of time. And it seems to us, and the comment he made was, it seems to me that electric cars are doing the same thing. That there was a little bit of reluctance to accept these things for a couple years, and now the momentum has completely flipped, and everybody is either thinking about these things or looking at these things, or in the case of the 3 of us, buying these things. 2 years ago, I would have told you, no, I'm not going to buy an electric car. Battery technology isn't there. You know, there were just all these inconvenient reasons not to do it. Now, you know, my only complaint, having had this thing for a month, is that I still have to keep my gas-powered car because mine only gets 80 miles range. If that thing had 200 miles of range, I would sell my fossil fuel car immediately. Not sure I'd get much for it, but I would sell it immediately. All right. I've got a lease on this thing for 3 years, and I'm betting in the next 3 years, battery technology is going to improve to the point where that new little car will get 200 or 300 miles on a charge. And in which case I am done completely with fossil fuel cars for driving me around. Just no reason to have them at all, right? Love that little guy with that one little complaint, and it's going quick. So I think we're going to reach those, and I'm going to find out. I will not at all be shocked if we sell, you know, in the United States, we're going to sell, on a good year, we sell 18 million cars. In our bad years, we've been down as low as 12. So, China's about the same. They passed us. I think they're up to 19 million cars sold per year. So that's about 5%. I know we're not there now. We were still only at 1% last year. So what's that? That's only about 180,000 of them. But this year, I will not be surprised if that number. I bet that number is 500,000. I'm just going to guess that, then I'm going to look it up for you, tell you guys if that's true. So yes, I think we're seeing an enormous change in that right now, and watches. I think just sort of watch it coming. It's as interesting for me to watch the change in electric cars as it is to watch the collapse of crude oil prices over the last month. I don't know how many of you guys have been paying attention to this. $80 a barrel today. Really fascinating. Fascinating because I think it's short-lived, unfortunately. I think the price is going to go right back up. But really interesting to see what it's doing to the fracking industry, what it's doing to people's perception of petroleum. And I think part of that is, that those electric cars are coming online, so our demand is dropping quicker than people thought. Okay, but let's get back to answering real questions. So, what is the overall thermochemical conversion life cycle in terms of greenhouse gas? Could we have a biodiesel comparative table with green algae, diatoms, tropha, like wheat for corn ethanol, comparison of greenhouse gas versus cellulosic ethanol? Okay, so what Sophie's asking is, what is the life cycle of thermochemical conversion in terms of greenhouse gas? So this one is really hotly debated in thermochemical, all right? And the reason we don't have a nice comparative table like that is because unlike corn ethanol, where it's a big industry and people know really well what all the components of a life cycle assessment are. Remember, when you're doing a life cycle assessment, those get better over time. And the reason they get better over time is once you actually go and build first a pilot facility and then a commercial facility, well, then you're not guessing anymore about what the inputs are. You're actually measuring them. Anything short of actually having a commercial plant, what you're doing is you're trying to extrapolate from either a small pilot facility or even worse than that, a lab, experiment. And you sort of say, oh, in my lab experiment, my thermochemical conversions were this efficiency, and my feedstock import was, corn stubble. So then I make some assumptions on what's my greenhouse gas emissions from corn stubble and what's my greenhouse gas emission. But when you start to scale these things up, it doesn't always work out. Sometimes you have problems and you have to change your feedstock. So for example, there isn't enough corn stubble, so I've got to go to a different feedstock. And when I go to a different feedstock, that has a different greenhouse gas footprint. Sometimes when you scale up, what you find out, you're kind of pleasantly surprised, and you scale up and you're like, oh, I can actually do my heat capture, which is really important on thermochemical conversion, right? You have to heat that up to very high temperature. And then when you bring that temperature back down, you want to recapture as much of that heat energy as you can, all right? And sometimes when you go to bigger scale, it turns out you can capture more of that, okay? So unfortunately with thermochemicals, there was only one pilot plant up and running by a company called Kior. And they unfortunately went belly up. I don't think they've declared complete bankruptcy, but they stopped running their pilot facility about 3 months ago. And the reason they stopped running it is because the assumptions they had made at bench scale did not hold up when they went and built out their bigger pilot plant. And so when they built it out, actually they were not recapturing nearly as much of the heat that they were putting in to degrade. They were using corn stubble. They were out in Colorado, and so they were using straw and corn stubble for their feedstock. So they didn't have any problem with that. They were still getting all of that. But when they took that up to high temperatures, they were not capturing enough of the heat coming back out. And it was just clear to everybody after they got it up and ran it that the economics weren't going to work out. So, sorry, again, the simple answer to your question was the reason we don't have that comparison of like corn ethanol or even cellulosic ethanol is because those we already have pilot plants up and running. we know exactly, or much better now, what the inputs are on that and what the parameters are for the life cycle assessment, so we can do much better ones. We now have our third, by the way, cellulosic ethanol plant just opened today. I just saw a little announcement for it. So it's come online. 3 of them are up and running. It's probably going to be a year. We're going to have to run those things. So probably till this time next year before we get really good data on all the inputs of those things. And then we'll know much better. So they're 50 million gallon per year pilot plants. Of course, they're only running at a fraction of that when you first start, because it takes a while to build up sort of that head of steam that you have to have the whole plant running up and humming. So a year from now, we'll have had it up and running. They will have had it up and running for many months, and then they'll be able to do a much better life cycle assessment and a much better economic assessment. You know, right now, the guesses range anywhere from, some people say they'll be at $2.29 a gallon for ethanol, and other people are, it's going to be $5 a gallon. And but that's what a pilot plant's for. A pilot plant is to get you up, to get you running, to make real product, to be able to measure all parameters of it, so you're no longer making extrapolations from your little tiny bench scale thing, but you're actually making extrapolations from a plant that is commercial, right? That doesn't mean you're making, you know, 50 million, might not be big enough to drive the complete economics complete with fossil fuel, but you are at a scale where all of your parameters and all of your economics can be measured really well. So so that's going to be kind of some exciting stuff that I think is going to come out in the next year. Okay, here's another one. Let me see if I can select it. Come on. All right, for some reason it's not letting me select it, but it says how much of the cost in making biodiesel is in buying or making the catalyst to make the FAME process go. Well, so biodiesel is always, the cost of that is always driven by your feedstock, because the price of the oil input in is always the most expensive part of that, right? There's just no way around that one. Catalysts, by their nature, are supposed to be cheap because they're catalysts. Okay, that means they get used many, many times. Now, there is some expense to those because over time you foul them, and that means during the whole process of you know, what the catalyst does, which is turning the precursor into the product, you degrade that catalyst over time. So catalysts do have some life, and you try to regenerate those things sometimes. Now, if you're doing FAME, which is fatty acid methyl ester, your catalyst is either acid or base. It's nothing. It's dirt cheap. But you can get fancier catalyst when you're making biodiesel, or when you're making something which we now call renewable diesel. And that means that you're actually rearranging the hydrocarbons as you go. And in that cases, in those cases, the catalyst, you know, are not just acid or base. They can be much fancier than that, and therefore they can be they can have some expense. But by and large, it's never the major thing. Feedstock on biodiesel is always number one. Nothing else even comes close to that. Okay, let's try one just to get one from somebody different here. And this comes from John McClintock, and he says, why does diesel have lower horsepower, giving off more soot and smell worse than burning gasoline? And these are qualities Americans are put off by. So first of all, I should say that is you know, that's a prejudice which is not true anymore. So it's true today that you will occasionally see a truck driving around that is running low quality diesel gasoline in it. And that low quality diesel will put out soot, and you'll see the big black smoke, and it will stink. Okay? And then you will see all the other cars driving around you with gasoline engines, and they're not putting out any of that stuff. That is not an inherent part of either a diesel or a gasoline engine. It has to do with how crappy the fuel is that you put into it. the diesel fuel that you buy for a car now is really high quality. So if you get a diesel car engine and don't put in that high sulfur, you know, crappy fuel into it, those things burn really clean. In fact, if you go to Europe, most of the cars are diesel, and when you see a diesel car driving down the road, you cannot possibly tell the difference between that and a gasoline car by what's coming out the back. They simply look indistinguishable. So don't blame the diesel engine, blame the crappy fuel. Why, you know, historically did we have crappy diesel fuel? That's because a diesel engine, because of the way it works, because what you do is you compress the air and that gets it hot and then squirt the fuel into it and that explodes and pushes the cylinder out. Because of the way that works, those engines can use worse fuel and still function okay. Okay? Doesn't mean they have to have crappy fuel. It just means you can still run an engine on pretty crappy diesel. And in fact, if you ever go out on a boat, those diesel engines tend to run on low quality, low cost fuel, which is sometimes called, I think it's called bunker oil. And bunker oil is the lowest quality fuel you get out there, and boat engines run on that because when you're out in the ocean, you're allowed to dump that crappy soot and stinky stuff out into the atmosphere because most of it's going to fall into the ocean and not come back on land. So it's low quality fuels are cheaper, and so some places are allowed to burn them. But boy, not in cars, not in Europe, and not in the United States anymore. That diesel fuel now has to be super high quality, and it is. So people who buy diesel engines now love them. I think I told this story before. I rented one when I was over in Ireland last year. That thing got great gas mileage, super zippy, and boy, I never saw any black smoke or stink coming out of the tailpipe on it. It was a lovely little car that drove really fast and ran on diesel fuel, which in Ireland, by the way, was something like $7.50 a gallon. Right? Fuel in Europe is expensive, so you are very happy when you get a good, very high, very high miles per gallon on that little car. Okay, Danielle says, at first sight, Professor Torrey's vision of future houses with solar cells, wind turbines, or even electric storage is amazing, but won't it be more expensive than the use of centralized power station? Yeah, so that's a very interesting question. All right, and dang, that's good insight from you. So there's two parts to that. So when you go, you always get something called economies of scale, and this is true whether you're talking about power generation or whether you're talking about a farm, right? You can always, the bigger the scale you get, so centralized power station, a really big power station, every watt that you produce from that can be cheaper than you produce it at smaller scale. But when you have solar cells or wind turbines on top of every house out there, that's called a distributed electrical system. And those things tend to be much more stable. And the reason for that is kind of obvious, right? And that is that if I have, photoelectric cells, PV cells on top of everyone's house, and somebody's fails because, I don't know, an asteroid smashed their PV panels, or there was a short in their wiring, well, that doesn't bring everybody down. In fact, if every house had one of those and you had 50,000 houses in your community, if you lost one, you wouldn't even notice it. So the more distributed you get, the grid tends to be much more stable. So you get that benefit. The second benefit you get is when you have a big, centralized one, like I don't know if I showed you guys these pictures or not. So these beautiful new solar power concentrating farms that are in between Las Vegas and they're right on the border between California and Nevada. Just fantastic. Go online and get them. Google owns one of them and a couple other people. These little towers where all the mirrors shine light on them. And so you're getting this. So rather than photovoltaic, it's photothermal. So you're actually heating that up and then generating electricity from that. So those things are super efficient. They're They're actually producing electrical power cheaper than any of the power plants around. But of course, the problem with those is now you've got a big footprint out in the middle of the desert, about a mile circle is what I understand those things are. Like I said, Google them and beautiful pictures, right? And an amazing little engineering feat. But now you've got this enormous footprint. So what used to be in that mile square? You know, there used to be turtles and there used to be birds and desert tortoises, I should say, not turtles. There used to be desert tortoises and lizards and birds. And so those things aren't there anymore. They've been displaced. All right. So yes, when you go to really large scale, they can be more efficient. But when you go to really large scale, there also can be more unstable, because if a big central power plant goes down, then power to everybody's house is gone. All right. So there are pros and cons of both of it. We've tended in the past to do things big scale and go for maximum efficiency. But you lose something with that, right? Photovoltaic, you know, the PV cells on top of my house, those aren't going to displace any lizards or any birds. There's nothing up on top of my house now except tiles, and I went on top of it. So I think, you know, it's sort of a balance. It's a balance between maximum efficiency and therefore lowest cost versus best use of our space. And so, although I'm really happy to see some of these big thermal systems go in, because I think they will definitely help, and I would rather see those than fossil fuel plants. I wouldn't want to turn the entire desert into those. I think we need to keep some open lands and do those things. So again, I think the message should be it's a balance. You know, some of both are probably going to be the best way to go. As many people as can put photovoltaic, you know, PV and wind turbines at their house and get those things onto the grid. And then we're going to add on top of those a couple of centralized big power stations. And then maybe the combination of all that will really reduce our carbon footprint and our fossil fuel use, and at the same time make the grid more stable. I'll make one last comment, that there are simply some places on the planet, some countries on the planet, where they simply lack, you know, the wherewithal to build enormous centralized power stations. So go and look at Alex Zan's talk about Nepal. There is no grid, all right? So even if you had an enormous centralized power station, you don't have electric wires going to anybody's house. But in each individual house, if we can put in a solar cell there that provides enough power, or a wind turbine that provides enough power to put in 5 watts of energy per person per day, we will change those people's lives. They will be able to read at night, and they will be able to study, and they will be able to cook without having to have wood fire lighting, and that'll improve their health, and a dramatic improvement. And in that case, we simply leapfrog, you know, Nepal having to build that entire enormous infrastructure of electrical wires and power generating stations to bring electricity to every single house. We can just put it in a small little decentralized way. So enormous opportunity in the developing world for small, distributed, power generating systems to change their life. And we're going to figure out a way before this class is over so that we can take the power that we're saving here in the United States and in Europe, each one of us. So I'm going to figure out a way when I put my photovoltaics on top of my house next month, and therefore I'm no longer pulling power off the grid. I'm going to figure out a way to get that over to Nepal and Alex. I don't know how yet, but we're going to do it. We're going to crowdsource this, and we're going to come up with ways. And all of you guys are going to help me. Okay, we have time for one last question. And that one last question comes from Sophie G. And she says, can biomass used to produce biodiesel be identical to cellulosic ethanol? So the answer is yes. That's a very quick answer on that. Even if the output isn't the same fuel, is it greener to use biomass to produce cellulosic ethanol, as there's no NOx, CO2, and SOx emission? Okay, so let me go back now and answer this a little better. So thermochemical conversion. What you're doing is you're taking biomass, and it can be any biomass. That's the really lovely thing about that. It can be trash, it can be plastic, it can be anything that has got carbon in it. And then at very high temperature, you break that down to small things. And those small things are generally carbon monoxide and hydrogen. And then you cool that and let those build back up, generally into what people call mixed alcohols. And the reason for that is as these things tend to reassemble, you end up with alcohols, and then they're not ethanol or butanol or pentanol. They're kind of a combination of all those things. That's why they're called mixed alcohols. So in some ways, what you end up with is actually a superior fuel to ethanol that comes from fermentation of cellulosic ethanol. Because ethanol, although it can be blended into gasoline at 5%, no problem at all, and works in a hydrocarbon engine, those longer chain alcohols, butanol, pentanol, the longer chain you get, the more compatible they are with hydrocarbon fuel. So you can blend them at a higher level. So in some ways, the fuels that come out of thermochemical conversion, those mixed alcohols can actually be better. You can blend them at a higher rate. So they're not the same fuel, but they're similar. Okay, but then the second part of that question, if it's not the same fuel, is it greener to use biomass to produce cellulosic ethanol? So greener, I assume by that what you mean is, are the fuels that come out of that either better as they're burned, or is there lower greenhouse gas emission? So right now, thermochemical conversion is not a better greenhouse gas emission than cellulosic ethanol, at least by the sort of first analysis of it, by the biochemical conversion to cellulosic ethanol. The life cycle assessments of that say that biomass, biological conversion, so getting enzymes to degrade it down to sugars and then fermentation, gets a little better greenhouse gas than thermochemical conversion. But it's still early days. I sit on the advisory board for the National Renewable Energy Labs, and a couple of the other guys who sit on that are one of the vice presidents of Chevron and a guy from Exxon. And both of those guys don't like thermochemical conversion. The big oil companies have tried thermochemical conversion, doing what's called gas to liquids, in which they take methane and attempt to turn it into a liquid fuel. And they've spent a fortune doing that because they get something called stranded natural gas. And so they've spent a fortune, and they say, the economics and the life cycle assessment never work out for thermochemical. Go biochemical, to get enzymes to degrade it to ethanol and then switch it over, okay? And then turn that into fuel. So, and I don't know, it's still early days, and we still need some more research on that, and we need some pilot plants built, and we need to get better life cycle assessment, and then we can know. But as far as the NOx and SOx, that I don't no, they're not greener. All right, the fuels that come out of that, if you have sulfur in them and if you have nitrogen in them, and you put those into your gas tank, you are going to get NOx and SOx out of that. You're going to get CO2 no matter what. Okay, when you burn gasoline, whether that's ethanol or whether it's mixed alcohols, you're burning those. You're going to put out CO2. Greenhouse gases coming out the back. Those are the same. The NOx and SOx are completely dependent upon how much sulfur and how much nitrogen is in there, and that is your entire process. So you can clean both sulfur and nitrogen out of those fuels. It just costs you something, okay? And then how hot they burn, because there's nitrogen, in the air. You can actually get NOx. All engines, even gasoline engines, which have no nitrogen in the fuel, you still get NOx out your tailpipe, okay? So those are things we can clean out of them. There's a cost to that. In California, we tend to clean more of them out than in other places. Some places leave a little more sulfur in it, especially in some of the diesel fuels. It's expensive to get them out, but that's simply a cost of cleaning up the fuel before you go. So they're not greener in the sense that one has less of those than the other. The process tends to leave more of those in the thermochemical, a little bit less in the biochemical, but they're still in both of them, and you got to get rid of them. Okay, well, that's all the time we had today. Thanks very much for tuning in. Thanks for staying in on the class. Travis and I are thinking about ways that we are going to ship our electrons over there to Alex, and we're going to send an email out to you guys in the next couple weeks because we want all of you guys thinking about how we're going to do this too. We're going to crowdsource this. We need some good ideas on how, as we put efficiencies into the first world, into Europe, into America, you know, into the countries that use a lot of energy, as we get more efficient, and so we don't have to use as much of that energy, how are we going to ship that energy over to the people who really need it? In some ways, maybe we're just going to convert it. I don't know. Somebody said, convert it to Bitcoins and send them Bitcoins and they can use that to buy photovoltaics. I don't know. But I bet you guys have some really good ideas about that, and I want to hear about them. Okay? That's it for this week, and we will talk to you next week. Keep up the good work.